You know that feeling in the pit of your stomach when you're about to introduce someone you love with your whole heart to people you are related to? It's this horrible, churning cocktail of hope and dread. It's like a combination of a final job interview and a parole hearing. And your entire future happiness is what's up for review. That was me last Saturday night. I was about to introduce my incredible, wonderful fiancé to my family. I was hoping for their approval. What I got was a prosecution. If you've ever had to defend the person you love from the people who are supposed to love you, you're in the right place. Hit that like button, because this story might feel a little too familiar. My family, the Sharmas, live in a world of quiet, suffocating prestige. My father is a senior partner at a corporate law firm. My mother sits on the boards of 3 different charities. They live in a massive, sterile house in the wealthiest part of town, a place where the lawns are unnaturally green and the silence is broken only by the sound of distant tennis matches. Their value system is simple pedigree, profession, and perception. Who you are is less important than who people think you are. I had, for the most part, managed to meet their expectations. I was Dr. Anya Sharma, a child psychologist with a thriving private practice and a PhD, from a university they could proudly name drop at cocktail parties. I was their successful daughter, the one who had done everything right, until Marco. Marco was different. He was the antithesis of everything my family valued, and the embodiment of everything I had discovered I actually needed. He was kind, grounded, and possessed a quiet, unshakable confidence that came not from a fancy degree, but from the simple fact that he knew who he was. He was a man who built things with his hands, and he had, over the past year, meticulously rebuilt me. "Are you sure they'll like me?" he asked as we pulled up to my parents' intimidatingly large front door. He was smoothing down the collar of his new button-down shirt, a nervous energy radiating from him. Maybe the tattoos were a bad idea. I reached over and took his hand. His hands were his story. They were strong and calloused, with faint traces of wood stain under his fingernails that no amount of scrubbing could ever fully remove. I loved his hands. I loved his tattoos, the intricate vines that snaked up his forearms, a testament to a wilder youth he had never been ashamed of. "They will love you," I lied, with all the desperate hope of a person who wanted it to be true. "Once they get to know you, they'll see what I see." The moment my mother opened the door, I knew I had been hopelessly naive. "Anya, darling," she said, pulling me into a stiff, air-kiss hug. Her eyes immediately flicked to Marco. Taking him in from head to toe, I saw the brief, almost imperceptible flicker of her gaze on his tattooed forearms, and the slight tightening of her smile. "And you must be Marco. It's so lovely to finally meet you." My father's handshake was a test, a brief, aggressive assertion of dominance. "Marco," he said, his voice a low boom. "Anya has told us so much about you." Another lie. I had barely told them anything, because I knew this was coming. The dinner was a slow-motion car crash. It started politely enough, with my mother asking about the weather and my father pouring a wine that cost more than my weekly grocery bill. But then, the interrogation began. "So, Marco," my father started, leaning forward with the air of a prosecutor beginning his cross-examination. "Anya tells us you're in business for yourself. What is it you do, exactly?" Marco, bless his heart, answered with a simple, unashamed pride that I knew was his first mistake. "I own a construction and restoration company, sir," he said. "We specialize in historical properties." "Ah, construction," my father said, the word tasting like something unpleasant in his mouth. "So, physical labor, then, that's interesting." He exchanged a look with my mother, a silent conversation that I could translate perfectly. "A construction worker. My God, it's very skilled labor," I interjected, my voice a little too sharp. "Marco is an artist with wood and stone. He restored the entire facade of my office building. It's a historical landmark." "How fascinating," my mother said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "And where did you go to school for that?" "Marco, at trade school." "I didn't go to college, ma'am," Marco said, his voice still even, though I could feel him tensing up beside me. "I went straight into a carpentry apprenticeship after high school. Started my own business when I was 22. The second mistake, The cardinal sin in my family's world, the lack of a university degree, it was, to them, the mark of a lesser species. My father picked up his wineglass, a sure sign of his disapproval. Commendable, in its own way, I suppose, he said. The condescension so thick I could feel it suffocating me. To build something on your own, but a university education. It's about more than just a career. It's about a certain a certain understanding of the world. The implication was clear. Marco was unpolished. He did not understand their world. Therefore, he was not good enough. They kept digging, their questions a series of polite, brutal shovel blows aimed at uncovering his unsuitability. They asked where he grew up, and his honest answer of a working-class neighborhood on the other side of the city was met with a tight, pained silence. They asked about his family, and his proud description of his plumber father and waitress mother was received as if he were describing a family of sewer dwellers. I tried to run interference. I tried to talk about his incredible talent, the beautiful, historic homes he had saved from ruin. I told them about his charity work, how he spent one weekend a month building houses for the underprivileged. They just smiled their tight, polite smiles and changed the subject. They didn't care about his character. They didn't care about his kindness or his talent. They were checking boxes on a social resume, and he was failing every single category. The final, excruciating act of the evening happened after dessert. Marco, bless him, excused himself to use the restroom, leaving me alone with the three of them. The moment the door closed behind him, the facade of politeness dropped. My father turned to me, his face a mask of cold, profound disappointment. "Amelia," he began, his voice a low, angry rumble. "I don't know what you are thinking. I don't know what this little rebellion of yours is about, but this has to stop." "What are you talking about?" I asked, though I knew exactly what he was talking about. "That man," he said, the words full of disgust. "A construction worker, a high school graduate with tattoos. He is not one of us. Amelia, he is not your equal, and you will not bring him into this family." "I am shocked." "Darling," my mother chimed in, her voice full of a practiced, wounded sorrow. "Truly shocked. You are a doctor. You come from a good family. And this is who you choose. Think of your reputation. Think of your future. What will our friends say when you introduce this laborer as your husband?" Husband. I hadn't even told them we were engaged yet. I had wanted to wait, to let them get to know him first. Another hopelessly naive hope. "I love him," I said, my voice trembling with a rage I was struggling to control. "He is a good, honorable, and brilliant man, and I don't give a damn what your friends think." "You should," my father snapped, "because your choices are a reflection on us, on this family. And this choice, this is a disgrace. You are disgracing yourself, and you are disgracing us by bringing someone like that into our world." Disgrace. The word hit me with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just disapproval. It was a verdict, a moral judgment. I had been weighed. I had been measured. And I had been found wanting. All because the man I loved worked with his hands instead of a briefcase. Marco came back into the room then, a small, polite smile on his face, completely unaware of the character assassination that had just taken place. The air in the room was thick with a new, icy tension. He could feel it. I saw the smile falter on his face as he looked at my parents' stony expressions. "Is everything okay?" he asked quietly. "Everything is fine," I said, standing up and grabbing my purse. I couldn't stay in that house a second longer. "We were just leaving. Thank you for dinner, Mom, Dad." The car ride home was a tomb of silence. I was shaking with a fury so deep it felt like it was coming from the center of the earth. I was ashamed, not of Marco, but of them, of my own blood. We pulled up to my apartment. Marco turned off the engine, and the silence seemed to grow even louder. "Well," he finally said, his voice full of a quiet, sad resignation. "That went about as badly as it possibly could have." And that's when I broke. The tears I had been holding back all night came in a hot, angry flood. They weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of pure, unadulterated rage. He didn't say anything. He just unbuckled his seatbelt, pulled me into his arms, and held me while I sobbed. He held me, his strong, calloused, wonderful hands stroking my hair, and he just let me be angry. When the tears finally subsided, I pulled back and looked at him. "I am so sorry, Marco," I whispered. "They don't know you." "I know," he said softly. "And you know what? It's okay. I'm not marrying them. I'm marrying you." I knew then that my father was wrong. Marco wasn't a disgrace. He was my home and my family. They had just drawn a battle line, and I knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and liberating, which side I was on. The silence in the car on the way back from my parents' house was heavy, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was dense with the things we weren't saying, with the insults that had been hurled, and with the quiet, unshakable solidarity that was forming between us in the wreckage. I was still vibrating with a cold, protective rage, but looking at Marco's calm profile in the glow of the streetlights, a different feeling began to surface, a profound, overwhelming sense of pride. My family saw a construction worker. They saw calluses and tattoos and a man without a fancy degree. They had no idea they were looking at the man who had, quite literally, rebuilt my world, starting with the crumbling brick and mortar of my professional life. Before I met Marco, my life had been orderly. I was successful, yes. My psychology practice was flourishing. I was respected in my field. I lived in a nice apartment. I had built a life that was a perfect, shining example of everything my family valued. It was also, if I was being honest with myself, a little sterile, a little lonely. It was a life built on achievements, not on passion. It was a well-designed house with no one living in it. The change began when I bought the building for my practice. It was a beautiful old brownstone in a historic part of the city, a building with good bones, high ceilings, and the most exquisite, detailed plasterwork I had ever seen. It was also a wreck. It had been neglected for decades, and the beautiful details were buried under layers of grime, cheap paint, and general decay. It was, I suppose, a lot like me at the time, a solid structure with a lot of potential, but in desperate need of someone who knew how to see past the dust. I didn't want a standard contractor who would just rip everything out and replace it with drywall and laminate. I wanted a restorer, an artist. After weeks of searching, a contact at the city's Historical Preservation Society gave me a name. "There's only one person I'd trust with a building like that," she'd said. "His name is Marco Rossi. His company is small, but he's a master." I remember the day he came for the initial consultation. I was expecting someone older, more academic. But the man who showed up was young, vital, and covered in a fine layer of sawdust that seemed to cling to his eyelashes. He had a faded t-shirt, worn jeans, and those now familiar tattooed forearms. He was not what I expected. But then he started to talk, and his voice, a low, thoughtful baritone, was full of a reverence that stunned me. He didn't talk about budgets or timelines at first. He walked through the decaying rooms and talked about the building's soul. "Look at this," he'd said, running his calloused hand gently over a section of water-damaged oak paneling in what was to be my office. "The grain on this, it's tiger oak, quarter sawn. They don't even harvest trees like this anymore. We can save this. It would be a crime to replace it." He looked at the crumbling ceiling medallion, not with dismay, but with a craftsman's admiration. "They don't make them like this anymore," he'd murmured, more to himself than to me. "This place has a story. Our job isn't to tear it down and write a new one. It's to find the original story and bring it back to life." I had hired him on the spot. The restoration took 8 months, and over those 8 months, as I watched him and his small, dedicated crew breathe life back into that beautiful old building, I fell in love. I fell in love not just with him, but with the values he embodied, values my family had never taught me. I saw his integrity. He would call me to point out ways we could save money, suggesting a less expensive but equally durable material for a non-essential area. He found a hidden stash of original, hand-painted tiles behind a wall during demolition and spent a week painstakingly cleaning and restoring them himself. A task he didn't even bill me for, simply because it was the right thing to do for the house. I saw his passion. He would stay late into the night, carefully stripping away layers of old paint from a door frame, a look of intense, focused joy on his face. He spoke about wood grain and joinery and lime plaster with the same intellectual fervor that I spoke about developmental psychology. His work wasn't a job, it was his art. I saw his kindness. I watched the way he treated his crew. He wasn't a boss who barked orders. He was a leader who taught, who listened, who worked alongside them. They respected him, not out of fear, but out of a deep, genuine admiration for his skill and his character. Our conversations started over dusty blueprints and paper cups of coffee. We would talk for hours, sitting on drop cloths in the middle of what would become my waiting room. He would explain the intricacies of restoring a century-old pocket door, and I would tell him about a breakthrough I'd had with a nonverbal patient. We were two people from completely different worlds, but we were both builders. He rebuilt houses. I rebuilt minds. We were both in the business of restoration. He was, I realized, the most genuinely successful person I had ever met. His success wasn't measured by a stock portfolio or a company car. It was measured by the quality of his work, the loyalty of his crew, and the stellar reputation he had built, one beautiful, restored building at a time. He was a self-made man in the truest sense of the word, a concept my father, who had spent his life climbing a corporate ladder someone else had built, could never comprehend. It was during that same period, as my own life was being so beautifully restored by Marco, that my family's seemingly perfect world was quietly imploding. I remember getting a panicked phone call from my mother one evening, about 6 months before I brought Marco home for the first time. Her voice was a hushed, terrified whisper. "It's your father," she'd said. "His company, the big deal they were counting on, fell through. The bank is calling in their loans. We're going to lose everything. Anya, the house, the savings, everything." For the next 2 weeks, I was on the receiving end of a series of frantic, desperate phone calls. My father, the proud patriarch, the man who had lectured me my entire life about financial stability, was a mess. His voice was full of a shame and a terror I had never heard before. He was on the verge of bankruptcy, of losing the very house he was now so desperate to protect from a man like Marco. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the crisis was over. I got another call from my mother, but this time, she was weeping with a joy that bordered on hysteria. "It's a miracle, Anya, a miracle." She'd cried. "Some investment firm, a benefactor. They came in completely out of the blue. They bought up all of your father's bad debt. For pennies on the dollar we're saved. Your father managed to pull it out of the fire at the last second. He's a genius." I knew my father was no genius. I knew he hadn't pulled anything out of the fire. They had been saved by a stroke of blind, anonymous luck. They had been on the brink of absolute ruin, and an angel investor had bailed them out. Their relief was so immense, so total, that they never stopped to question who this anonymous benefactor was, or why they would do such a thing. They just absorbed the miracle into their own narrative. It wasn't luck. It was a testament to my father's brilliance. They had been tested, and they had triumphed. They had pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps. And now, just 6 months later, they were sitting in their restored palace of prestige, looking down their noses at a man who had actually, literally, pulled himself up by his own bootstraps. The hypocrisy was so profound it was almost dizzying. After the disastrous dinner, I sat in my beautifully restored office. The warm glow of the reclaimed wood paneling a comforting presence around me. I ran my hand over the smooth, solid surface of my desk, a single, massive piece of mahogany that Marco had salvaged from a Gilded Age mansion and brought back to life. I could feel his integrity, his strength, his quiet artistry in the very grain of the wood. My phone buzzed. It was a text from my mother. "Your father and I are deeply disappointed, Amelia. We need to talk about your future." I looked at the text, at the arrogance, the complete lack of self-awareness. I thought of my father's terrified voice on the phone just 6 months ago, a man on the brink of losing everything. I thought of the angel investor who had saved him. I thought of Marco, a man of such quiet, profound decency, and I felt a slow, dangerous anger begin to take root. They had called him a disgrace. They had no idea what that word even meant. I put my phone down. My mother wanted to talk about my future. No. It was time for them to finally, truly, take a good hard look at their own, and I had a feeling the conversation was going to be one they were not prepared for. The morning after the disastrous dinner, the assault began. It wasn't a frontal attack. It was a campaign of 1,000 small cuts, a psychological war of attrition designed to wear me down, to make me doubt my own heart. The first text was from my mother, sent at 6:15 a.m. I couldn't sleep a wink last night. I'm just sick with worry about you. We need to talk. I stared at the message, the capital letters practically screaming from the screen. Sick with worry, it was her favorite phrase. It was a tactical deployment of maternal guilt, and she was a master strategist. I didn't reply. An hour later, she called. I let it go to voicemail. The message she left was a masterpiece of passive aggression, her voice full of a breathy, wounded sorrow. Anya, darling, it's Mom. I'm just so heartbroken by how last night went. Your father is beside himself. We just want you to be happy. We just want what's best for you. Please call me back. What's best for you, in her language. That meant what looks best for us. For the next 2 weeks, my phone became a weapon aimed at my own head. My mother would call daily, her tactics shifting. Some days, she was the weeping mother, wondering how she had failed, how her brilliant daughter could have such poor judgment. Other days, she was the disappointed socialite, talking about her friends' children and their wonderful partners. I was talking to Eleanor Bishop this morning at the club, she'd say, her voice casual. Her daughter, Catherine, the one who went to Yale Law. She just got engaged to the most wonderful young man. His family founded a private equity firm. They have a summer home in Nantucket. The comparison was left to hang in the air, a glittering, expensive jewel next to the lump of coal she imagined I had chosen. My father's calls were less frequent, but far more brutal. He didn't bother with the emotional manipulation. He went straight for the jugular, with the cold, authoritarian tone he usually reserved for junior associates at his law firm. Amelia, this is a phase, he told me during one call. His voice clipped and impatient. A rebellion, and it's beneath you. I want you to end it. Now. It's not a phase. Dad, I said, my voice shaking with a rage I was trying to suppress. I'm engaged to him. No, you're not, he said, as if he had the power to declare it so. Not until I give my approval, and I do not approve. Have you even run a proper background check on this fellow? Do you have any idea who his people are, what his history is? You are a respected professional. You are a Sharma. You will not throw your life away on some fortune-hunting laborer. The hypocrisy was so thick I could have choked on it. They were accusing Marco of being a fortune hunter, when they were the ones whose entire existence was predicated on the acquisition and display of wealth. The propaganda campaign soon spread to the wider family. My Aunt Carol called, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. Anya, dear, your mother told me about your new friend. She is so worried. We all are. A builder. You know, a man like that. He'll see a successful, educated woman like you as a meal ticket. You have to be so careful. They were painting a picture of me as a naive, love-struck fool, and Marco as a cunning predator. They were trying to poison him in the minds of everyone I had ever known, to isolate me, to make me feel like my choice was not just a disappointment, but a dangerous, foolish mistake. The most insulting maneuver, however, came from my mother. She invited me to a ladies' charity luncheon at her country club. Just us girls, she'd chirped. It'll be fun. I knew it was a trap, but I went anyway, a part of me still naively hoping that I could reason with her in person. I arrived to find her at a table with her 2 closest friends, and a 4th young man, a man I didn't know. Anya, darling, my mother said, her smile dazzlingly false. This is Spencer, this is my brilliant daughter, Anya. Spencer's father is a judge, and Spencer just made partner at his firm. He was just telling us the most fascinating story about securities litigation. Spencer, a man with a floppy haircut, a weak chin, and a soulless smile, stood up to shake my hand. The ambush was so blatant, so deeply insulting. I just stared at my mother, my face a mask of cold fury. She had invited me here to set me up, to parade a suitable man in front of me, a living, breathing exhibit of what I should be choosing over my disgraceful construction worker. I didn't sit down. "Mom," I said, my voice dangerously low and steady. "This was a lovely idea, but I'm leaving now." I turned and walked out of that dining room, the eyes of the entire luncheon following me. I could feel my mother's humiliation like a heat wave on my back. I got in my car and called Marco, venting my fury. He listened, as he always did, with a quiet, patient calm. "They're scared, Anya," he said when I was done, his voice a steady anchor in my storm. "They're not scared," I shot back. "They're snobs. They're bullies." "That too," he chuckled. "But underneath it all, they're scared. You're happy. And you're happy without their approval, without following their life plan for you. You've built your own life. And it doesn't revolve around them. That's terrifying to people who need to be in control. This isn't about me, babe. It never was. It's about them losing their power over you." His words, his clear-eyed, outsider perspective, cut through my rage and hit the core of the truth. He was right. This was a battle for my own autonomy. And with that realization, something inside me shifted. The hurt and the anger, while still there, were now being forged into something harder, something more useful resolve. I stopped answering their calls. I responded to my mother's long, manipulative text with a simple, "This is not up for discussion." I was building a wall, brick by brick, a boundary they had never encountered from me before, and it was driving them insane. Finally, they deployed their nuclear option. My father called. His voice was cold, formal, and devoid of any emotion. He was reading from a script. "Amelia," he began, "your mother, your brother, and I have had a long discussion. We have reached a unanimous decision." I waited, my heart a slow, steady drum. "We cannot, in good conscience, support this union," he said. "We cannot stand by and watch you make the biggest mistake of your life. We will not have that man as part of our family, so you have a choice to make." He paused, letting the weight of the ultimatum sink in. "If you go through with this wedding, if you choose to marry Marco Rossi, then you must understand that you are choosing to no longer be a part of this family. You will be cut off, financially and emotionally. We will be done. The choice is yours." The words were meant to be a sledgehammer, designed to shatter my resolve and bring me, their wayward daughter, back into the fold. He was so sure it would work. He had always believed that my greatest fear was their disapproval, their rejection. But he didn't know the new me, the me that had been rebuilt by a man who valued integrity over inheritance, the me who had finally learned the difference between a house and a home. The ultimatum wasn't a choice between Marco and my family. It was a choice between a future of love and respect, and a past of judgment and control. It was the easiest choice I had ever made. "Okay, Dad," I said, my voice quiet, but as firm and unshakable as the foundation of a house that Marco had built. "Okay," he repeated, confused by my lack of a hysterical reaction. "What does that mean?" "It means I understand," I said, "and I've made my choice." And he pressed, a note of desperation in his voice now. "And it was lovely talking to you," I said. "Goodbye." I hung up the phone before he could respond. I blocked his number, then I blocked my mother's, then my brother's. I stood in the quiet of my office, the phone in my hand, and I felt a profound seismic shift, a tearing away, a loss, but underneath it, for the first time in a very long time, I felt the solid, unshakable ground of my own life beneath my feet. Marco came in then, a concerned look on his face. What was that? I turned to him, a slow, real smile spreading across my face. I walked over and wrapped my arms around his neck, burying my face in his shoulder, breathing in the familiar, comforting scent of sawdust and him. That, I said, my voice muffled by his shirt, was the sound of me finally choosing my family. And I held on to him, my family, my future, my home. The silence that followed my final act of defiance, blocking my family's numbers, was absolute. For 2 blissful weeks, my phone didn't ring with my mother's worried yet accusatory tone. No texts appeared from my father, full of commands and disappointment. It was a strange, hollow peace, the kind that settles over a battlefield after the fighting has stopped. I knew it was just a ceasefire, not a surrender. Marco and I moved forward. We set a date. We found a venue, a beautiful, Restored old warehouse downtown with exposed brick and massive wooden beams. A place that felt like us. We were planning a small, intimate wedding, a celebration of our love, not a performance for my family's social circle. For the first time, I felt like I was building a future that was truly my own, on my own terms. Then the inevitable summons arrived. It came not as a text or a call, but as a formal, handwritten letter from my mother, delivered by courier. The expensive stationery smelled of her perfume. Her handwriting, usually so elegant, was shaky, full of a calculated maternal despair. My dearest Amelia, I know you are angry with us. Your father's heart is broken. He only ever wanted what was best for you. I lie awake at night, wondering where I went wrong as a mother, that my own daughter would feel the need to shut us out so completely. The guilt trip was laid on thick in the first paragraph. I braced myself for the rest. We understand that you have made your decision, and we feel we must respect it, however misguided we believe it to be. But I have one last thing to ask of you, before you take this final step, before you turn your back on your family for good. Please, just have one last dinner with us, as a family. No arguments, no pressure, just a proper goodbye. For me, it was a trap, a beautifully crafted, guilt-laden, emotionally manipulative trap. And I knew it. Marco knew it, too. It's an ambush, Anya, he said that night as he read the letter, his expression grim. I know, I said, tracing the embossed family crest at the top of the stationery. She's not giving up. She's just changing tactics. This is her last-ditch effort to talk some sense into me. You don't have to go, he said, his voice firm. You don't owe them anything. I know, I said again, a new, strange sense of resolve solidifying within me. But I need to close this chapter myself, face to face. I can't just leave it as a hung-up phone call. But this time, I looked at him, a small, determined smile on my face. I'm going in with my eyes open. No hope, no expectations, just finality. And so, we walked back into the lion's den. The atmosphere at my parents' house was not the same as it had been at that first disastrous dinner. The strained politeness was gone. It had been replaced by a heavy, somber mood, as if we were all gathered for a wake. My mother, dressed in a mournful shade of gray, greeted us with the teary-eyed resignation of a tragic heroine. My father's face was a mask of cold, stony disappointment. My brother, Ethan, who had apparently been called in as reinforcement, just gave Marco a look of pure, undisguised contempt. This was not a dinner, it was an intervention, a final supper before my scheduled crucifixion. The politeness of our first meeting was a distant memory. The gloves were well and truly off. The attack started before the appetizers were even served. Well, my father said as we sat down, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Look what the cat dragged in. I'm surprised you could get away from the construction site. Marco, don't you guys have to wake up at the crack of dawn? Some of us do, sir, Marco replied, his voice perfectly even. It's called running a business. My mother dabbed her eyes with a napkin. I just don't understand where we went wrong, Anya. She lamented to the room at large. To raise a daughter who has so little respect for herself, for her family's legacy, to throw it all away. The meal was an exercise in pure psychological torture. Every word was a veiled insult. Every question a loaded trap. My brother, Ethan, a junior analyst at some soulless financial firm, decided to take his shot. So, Marco, he began, leaning across the table with a smug, predatory grin. I've been thinking about your business model. It's a tough racket. Isn't it manual labor? Your body is your only real asset. What happens when you hit 40, 50? When your back gives out, there's no exit strategy. Is there no 401k, no stock options? What's it like? Hitting the jackpot with a woman like my sister, a doctor with a rich family. You must feel like you won the lottery. The accusation was so blatant, so ugly. It sucked the air out of the room. Gold digger. He had finally said the word they had all been thinking. Before I could unleash the torrent of rage that was building inside me, Marco spoke. He put his fork down, wiped his mouth with his napkin, and looked my brother directly in the eye. His expression was not angry. It was calm, almost pitying. My business model, Ethan, Marco said, his voice quiet but firm, is based on skill, reputation, and hard work. My body isn't my asset. My brain is, and my company did just over 7 figures in revenue last year. I'm not looking for a jackpot. I'm in love with your sister. Ethan just blinked, momentarily stunned into silence by a number he hadn't been expecting. But my father quickly recovered. Revenue is not profit, Marco, he sneered. Don't try to play with the big boys. You're out of your league. They continued their assault, relentless and coordinated. They attacked his lack of education. What will you even talk about at our dinner parties? Anya. My father lamented. He can't discuss Proust. He can't debate monetary policy. Will you just talk about hammers? They attacked his background. It's a matter of breeding, darling, my mother whispered to me, as if Marco couldn't hear. You can take the boy out of the working class, but you can't take the working class out of the boy. I just sat there, watching them. My psychologist mind cataloging it all. This wasn't about Marco, not really. It was about them, their fear, their insecurity. Marco, with his quiet confidence and his self-made success, was a mirror, and in it, they saw their own reflection, a group of people so terrified of not being good enough that they had to tear down anyone who didn't conform to their narrow, fragile definition of worth. Their cruelty wasn't a sign of their strength. It was the ultimate proof of their weakness. And then, my father went for the kill. He pushed his plate away, the gesture one of finality and disgust. He looked at me, his face a mask of righteous indignation. And to think you would do this now, he exclaimed, his voice rising. At a time like this, after the year this family has had, after we almost lost everything. He was referencing the financial crisis, the one they thought they had survived by their own wits. A proper marriage, a strong alliance between families, could have secured our future, he continued, his voice trembling with a self-pitying rage. You could have strengthened this family with your education and our name. You could have merged with the son of a judge, a CEO. Anyone, it would have guaranteed our legacy for a generation. But no. You chose this. You chose to bring this instability, this weakness into our lives when we were at our most vulnerable. He stood up then, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He picked up his wineglass, holding it aloft like a weapon. So yes, I will say it again, he declared, his voice ringing through the silent dining room. I am disappointed. I am disgusted. To think that my daughter, a Sharma, would choose to throw her life away on a fortune-hunting laborer, especially after we had to pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps just to survive. It is a disgrace. Thank God your grandfather isn't alive to see the shame you have brought upon this house. He slammed his wineglass down on the table, the red liquid sloshing over the rim onto my mother's pristine white tablecloth. A perfect spreading stain. The room was dead silent. All their ugly, prejudiced, and hypocritical beliefs had been laid bare. This was it, the final, damning indictment. My father stood there, heaving with a sense of his own tragic, righteous anger. My mother was weeping softly into her napkin. My brother was watching me with a look of smug victory. They thought they had won. They thought they had finally broken me. They had no idea that he had just handed me the loaded gun, pointed it at his own foot, and given me the explicit permission to pull the trigger. My father slammed his wineglass down on the table, the sharp crack of crystal against wood, and the dark red stain that immediately began to bloom across my mother's white tablecloth was the punctuation mark on his furious, final judgment, disgrace. The word hung in the air, thick and poisonous, a verdict from which there was no appeal. The dining room was dead silent. My father stood there, his chest heaving, his face flushed with the righteousness of his own hypocrisy. My mother was weeping into her napkin, the perfect picture of a wounded matriarch. My brother, Ethan, was watching me, a smug, triumphant smirk on his face. He looked like a wolf who had just helped the pack corner its prey, waiting for the final kill. They were all looking at me, waiting. They were expecting me to finally break, to burst into tears, to beg for their forgiveness, to apologize for my own happiness, to capitulate, to surrender. But as I sat there, pinned in the crossfire of their collective disappointment, a strange and wonderful thing happened. The fear was gone. The hurt was gone. The desperate, lifelong need for their approval was gone. All of it had been burned away by the sheer, ugly heat of their final assault. All that was left was a profound, almost serene clarity. I was a psychologist. I had spent my entire professional life observing human behavior, diagnosing dysfunction, and helping people find their way out of toxic patterns. And for the first time, I looked at my own family not as a daughter, but as a clinician. And the diagnosis was terrifyingly, liberatingly clear. This wasn't a family, it was a pathology, a closed system of snobbery, insecurity, and performative status. And I was the foreign body they were desperately trying to reject. I let the silence stretch. I let them sit in the ugly, uncomfortable quiet they had created. I watched the triumphant smirk on my brother's face begin to falter. I saw my father's righteous anger begin to cool into an impatient confusion. My calm was a response they hadn't anticipated. It was a variable that didn't fit their equation. Slowly, deliberately, I picked up my water glass and took a small sip. I placed it back on the table with a soft, definitive click. I looked at my father, the man who had just called my life a disgrace, while conveniently forgetting the financial precipice he had been dangling over just 6 months prior. "You're right about one thing, Dad," I began, my voice startlingly calm, and even in the tense silence. The family did have some recent troubles. The use of his own words, thrown back at him so gently, immediately put them on edge. My mother stopped crying and looked at me. Her eyes narrowed with suspicion. I let my gaze travel around the table, from my father's confused face, to my mother's wary one, to my brother's fading smirk. "You all seem to be operating under the narrative that you pulled yourselves up by your own bootstraps," I continued, my tone still conversational, as if I were discussing the weather. "That some anonymous miracle saved Sharma and Sons from ruin. It was no miracle," my father grumbled. His pride stung. "It was a vote of confidence in my leadership, an investor who saw the underlying value of the company. He was already rewriting history, trying to reclaim his role as the hero of his own story. An investor," I repeated, nodding slowly. "Yes, an angel investor. I believe you called him. Someone who came in at the 11th hour, right after the bank had called in your loans. Someone who bought up all of your bad debt." "What's your point, Anya?" my brother Ethan snapped, his patience wearing thin. I ignored him. My focus was entirely on my father. He was the king of this broken little kingdom, and it was his throne I was about to usurp. I looked him directly in the eye. My voice was not loud. It was not triumphant. It was quiet. It was factual. And it was absolutely devastating. "The anonymous angel investor," I said, each word placed with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "The one who wired Sharma and Sons $250,000 last October so you could make payroll and avoid filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy." I paused, letting the silence in the room deepen, pulling the tension as tight as a wire. "That wasn't a miracle, Dad. That was Marco." The sentence, so simple, so quiet, landed in the center of their world and detonated, blowing their entire reality to smithereens. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the ringing in my own ears. They stared at me, their faces a perfect, frozen tableau of non-comprehension. It was as if I had just started speaking in fluent Swahili. The statement was so impossible, so completely outside the bounds of their carefully constructed narrative, that their brains simply refused to process it. My brother was the first to react, with a short, ugly bark of a laugh. "What, are you insane? That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard." "Him." He pointed a finger at Marco, who had remained silent and stoic through the entire dinner. "The construction worker. Where would he get that kind of money?" My mother just stared, her hand fluttering to her throat, her eyes darting between me, Marco, and my father, trying to make sense of the new, impossible data. But my father was silent, because unlike my brother, he knew the exact amount of the bailout, to the dollar. It was a number that had been burned into his memory during weeks of sleepless, terrified nights. Marco, who had endured their insults with a quiet, powerful grace all evening, finally spoke. He did not look at my father or my brother. He looked at me, and his voice was full of a gentle strength. The wire transfer, he said calmly, was for $247,512.81. It was the exact amount of the promissory note the bank was calling in. Your company's controller, a man named David Chen, can confirm the number. The specificity of it, that was the kill shot. A random guess would have been a round number. This was the precise, ugly, and irrefutable truth. I watched my father's face. It was like seeing a statue crumble in slow motion. The ruddy color of his rage drained away, leaving behind a pale, grayish, slack-jawed mask of pure, horrified shock. The man he had just called a disgrace, a laborer, a fortune hunter, an unpolished man who was not their equal. That man was his savior. The anonymous benefactor he had privately hailed as a genius. The angel who had rescued his legacy was the same man he had just finished trying to utterly destroy. His story of pulling himself up by his own bootstraps was a lie. He hadn't been saved by his own business acumen or his reputation. He had been saved by the quiet, unacknowledged generosity of the man he had just deemed unworthy of his daughter. The hypocrisy of it, the sheer crushing weight of his own monstrous behavior, finally came crashing down on him. My mother let out a small, strangled sound, like a dying animal. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with a new kind of horror, not the horror of a disappointed mother, but the horror of a socialite who has just committed a catastrophic, unforgivable faux pas. They hadn't just been rude. They had been monstrously, unforgivably ungrateful to the one person who had saved them from public ruin and humiliation. Ethan just stared at Marco, his smug smirk gone, replaced by a look of sick, bewildered respect. The gold digger he had been mocking was the only reason there was still a family company for him to have a job at. They were all silent, utterly, completely, and finally speechless. The word hung in the air, a final, shimmering testament to their broken pride, disgrace. But it was no longer aimed at me. It had turned, like a boomerang, and come flying back to find its true owners. They had been so obsessed with judging Marco's worth. They had never stopped to consider their own, and now, in the quiet, ugly aftermath of the truth, they were finally being forced to look at it. The silence that followed my single sentence was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It was a roar of shattered pride, of incinerated arrogance, of a worldview so completely and utterly demolished that it left a vacuum in its place. The dining room, which had been a theater for their judgment, had just become a tomb. My father stood frozen, his hand still resting on the wineglass he had slammed down. All the color had drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, slack-jawed mask of disbelief. He stared at Marco, not with the contempt of moments before, but with the horrified, uncomprehending gaze of a man looking at a ghost. The man he had called a disgrace, a laborer, a fortune hunter, was his savior. His entire narrative of himself as the proud patriarch who had weathered a financial storm through his own genius was a lie. And the proof was sitting right at his table, looking back at him with a calm, steady gaze. My mother's hand was pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with a different kind of horror, the social horror, the shame. She hadn't just been rude to her daughter's fiancé. She had presided over the ritualistic humiliation of her own family's anonymous benefactor. The sheer, unmitigated social catastrophe of it was, I knew, the only thing she could truly feel. And my brother, Ethan, his smug, confident smirk had vanished, replaced by a sick, greenish pallor. The gold digger he had so gleefully mocked was the sole reason he still had a cushy job at the family company to be arrogant about. He looked at Marco with a new, terrified respect. He was looking at real power, and it was nothing like the cheap, flashy performance he had spent his own life cultivating. They were speechless, utterly, completely, and finally, speechless. I had waited my entire life for them to see me, to understand me. I had craved their approval, twisted myself into knots trying to earn it, and in that moment, I realized I didn't need it anymore. I didn't need them to see me at all. All I needed was for them to see themselves. And my one quiet sentence had given them a mirror. I didn't wait for an apology. An apology would have been a performance. Another desperate attempt to salvage the situation. The time for talk was over. Slowly, deliberately, I folded my napkin and placed it on the table beside my plate. The small, quiet sound was like a gavel striking in the silent room. I stood up. Marco stood with me, a silent, solid presence at my side. I looked at my father, at the broken man who was left in the place of the raging patriarch. "I think we're done here," I said, my voice not triumphant, not angry, but quiet and full of a sad finality. I walked over to Marco and placed my hand on his shoulder, my engagement ring catching the light of the chandelier. A silent, unshakable statement of allegiance. "Let's go home." "Anya, wait," my mother whispered, her voice a strangled, desperate sound. I paused at the door, but I didn't turn around. I didn't want to see her face, to see the frantic calculation in her eyes, as she tried to figure out how to spin this, how to fix this, how to get back in the good graces of the money. "Goodbye, Mom," I said to the closed door in front of me, and then we walked out. We walked out of that house, out of that stuffy, suffocating room of judgment, and into the cool, clean night air, and as the heavy oak door clicked shut behind us, it felt like the sound of a prison cell locking from the outside, with them still trapped inside it. The car ride was quiet for a long time, as we drove through the dark, manicured streets of their neighborhood, leaving the world of appearances behind. I was the one who spoke first. "I'm sorry," I said, looking out at the passing lights. "I'm sorry you had to go through that you had to listen to that." He reached over and took my hand, his calloused fingers lacing through mine. "Don't be," he said, his voice a warm, steady rumble. "I'm not. I am so incredibly proud of you tonight." He squeezed my hand. "You spoke your truth. They needed to hear it," I whispered. "No, babe," he said, and his words hit me with a profound sense of clarity. "You needed to say it. There's a difference. He was right. I hadn't done it for them. I had done it for me. It wasn't an attack. It was an act of liberation. I didn't do it for them, either, you know," he added quietly after a moment. "The money?" I asked. "Yeah," he said. "I mean, your dad's company was a sound investment. Good bones. Just badly managed. But that's not why I did it. I did it because I saw what their financial stress was doing to you. I saw how their panic and their fear was something they were using as a weapon against you. I wanted to take the weapon out of their hands. I did it for you." I looked at him then, at this good, decent, honorable man, and I felt a wave of love so powerful it almost took my breath away. My family, in their blindness, had called him a fortune hunter. The truth was, he was a protector. He had protected my father's company to protect me from my father. It was an act of love so deep and so selfless. My family wouldn't even have the vocabulary to understand it. We got married 3 months later. It wasn't at the country club. It was in the beautifully restored old barn of a historic inn upstate, a building Marco's company had spent a year bringing back to life. The guest list was small, filled with our closest friends and Marco's loud, warm, wonderful family, who welcomed me with open arms and absolutely no questions about my pied d'identité or my pedigree. My family did not come. After that night, there had been a series of frantic, fumbling voicemails and texts, a pathetic mixture of disbelief, rage, and half-hearted, self-serving apologies. I didn't respond to any of them. The boundary had been set. The silence was the answer. Our wedding was perfect. It was full of laughter and dancing and the kind of real, unpretentious joy that my family had spent their entire lives trying to imitate with money. As Marco and I had our first dance, under the warm glow of the Edison bulbs hanging from the ancient, hand-hewn wooden beams, I thought about that one sentence. It wasn't an act of revenge. It was an act of truth, and the truth had, in its own brutal, elegant way, set me free. My family had built their entire world on a foundation of shallow, bankrupt values. They judged people by their jobs, their degrees, their bank accounts. They were so obsessed with the price of everything that they had forgotten the value of anything. They called Marco a disgrace because he didn't fit into their small, shiny world. But he was the one who had quietly, anonymously, saved it. His character was his currency. and it was a currency they were too poor in spirit to ever recognize. So what happened to my family, I honestly don't know. I stopped checking. I stopped asking. I was too busy building my own life, my own family, with a man who knew the value of a solid foundation. My one sentence didn't destroy them. It just held up a mirror. And if they were destroyed by their own reflection, that was a debt they had to settle with themselves.